Gracious God, we give you thanks for this time together. Pray for your Spirit to guide and direct us as we reflect on the state of religion in our culture. Help us to gain new insights of who we are and where we are, and how we can be better disciples of yours. So bless our time together, we pray, in your Son's holy name. Let God's people say, Amen. Okay, here we are. Hopefully, you all got the schedule for the readings that were posted the last 4 or 5 weeks. And you'll see that there are basically 10 chapters, 2 chapters a week. And that means that we've got about 20 to 25 minutes for each chapter. Now, yes, the book is substantial. It was the choice of the Adult Enrichment Committee that they chose me to do, and that's fine. And this is at least the theory behind how we deal with the material, is that ideally you would read the chapters, 2 chapters during the week, ideally. Now, I understand that sometimes that doesn't get done. What I used to say to my students out of community college was, if you can't do that, at least try to read the first 4 pages and the last 3 pages of each chapter. That's where, as a journalist, what you get, he sets what he's going to do in that chapter, and he concludes, boom, his argument for that chapter. And then I will say that his rhetoric and his writing at the end of the chapter is at its finest. And particularly the closing paragraphs. They are really right on. So at least try to skim it, but the first 3 pages and the last 4 pages, you can't do anything else with that. Midweek, they will post the handouts. The handouts, the post will be 2 pages, but the handouts will be front and back. And what I try to do in those is pull out the essence in each chapter, the roadmap. Try to make it a little simpler, maybe. That what you get lost in the chapters, you might be able to navigate it a little bit better and to guide our discussions that we have. So that's what the handouts try to do. So if you can do that in preparation for our time together, you can have some discussion rather than me talking about stuff. And if we're lucky, we can deal with 2 chapters a week. Does that make sense? Now, the key is going to be the prologue. That handout you might want to keep with you because he sets and frames what he's trying to do in this whole book. Ross Douthat is a journalist for the New York Times. If you read the Sunday Times, it usually has an article in the op-ed section. So that name will be familiar there. And yes, he's a very sophisticated writer, and it may not be easy going, but hopefully we can sort of sort it out and make it reasonable and easy to get at. Question, does that make sense in terms of how to get at this stuff? And so since they didn't give me that much time, I'm going to try to squeeze it in there as much as possible. And the homework assignment for each time is that in each chapter, for you to note the one thing that stands out for you. What one thing hits you? Whatever it is. You'll read that and you go, what is that? Just note what it is. And if we have time, we'll share that with each other. And there's no right or wrong answer with that. It's just like, oh, wow, what is that? Just note what that is in each chapter for you. And it'll be Whether it's on the handout or not, who cares? I mean, just note what that is in each chapter. So we got that? So we'll start with the prologue, where he's trying to set out key definitions and what he's trying to do in this book. Now, you have to be careful. Already, he says, a bad religion. That may not have been the best title for this thing, because number one, when he talks about how we've become a nation of heretics, you'll see in the prologue, he doesn't consider heresy necessarily bad. But when you say Rob's a heretic, what does that automatically in your mind say about Rob? He is I mean, you say bad. I say Terry's bad. All of a sudden, you have what kind of a notion in your mind? Negative. And so we probably should email him and say, "Did you want to reconsider the title?" That might help us a little bit, because when people are seeing the title for this class, they're saying, wonder what this is going to be about. So you have to almost wipe that out so we can get into what he wants to do. And so you note in your handout the major assumption that he states right off the bat on page 2 is that at the deepest level, every human culture is religious. Now, in teaching world religions out at St. Pete College, he defines it this way. It's very broad, by what its inhabitants believe about some ultimate reality, whatever that ultimate reality is, and what they think that ultimate reality demands of them. And that ultimate reality can be anything. That's what that particular culture says it is. And you go, oh, okay. Now, and when he states that, in your own mind, what is he going to have to do? He's going to have to define that ultimate reality, is he not? And understand, he is dealing with religion in the United States post-World War II. That's what he's going to be looking at. He's going to say, what is the consensus of religion in America post-World War II? And understand that he is limiting that to the broad Christian tradition. Not looking at Jewish or non-Christian traditions, just the broad Christian tradition that he's looking at. So he's going to have to define what that is as he gets into it. Now,
But I have one question. Sorry.
yes,
You talk about post, but he also spoke pre that period. It was surprising it wasn't as religious. America wasn't as religious as I had thought.
well, it's interesting as you look at post-World War II, when we get into chapter 1, in the 50s, if you can remember back to the 50s, I was just an innocent babe, but what happened to religion in America in the 50s? That's chapter 1. Religion just exploded, particularly Christian religion. What happened to churches? They grew like topsy.
Exponential growth.
I mean, exponential growth is right. I mean, he spent about 10 pages talking about that growth. I mean, it was incredible in the 50s. I'm not talking about anything after the 50s, but that incredible growth. I mean, it was like everybody came home, and up in the Northeast, Levittown and those kinds of housing, tract housing just exploded. I mean, it was everywhere. I mean, boom, the kind of growth post-World War II that took place. So he was talking about that kind of growth in chapter 1.
Sorry, I had
Yeah, as you look at that. But here, as he's looking at it, he's saying, look at how you look at religion today. And remember, he's a journalist, and he's saying, for his perspective, it falls into two different categories. You have those who are religious and saying, hey, basically, we've fallen away from the faith of our fathers. And because we've fallen away from that, we've lost track. And then you have the other side that says, the secularists that say we're too religious. And those religious people have led us astray. And so you have the two strands that are at odds with each other, and we are a divisive country. And Douthit says, is it either or? He said, you know, both of them. He talks about the arguments of both of them, and he said, you know, both of them have a point. Both of them aren't all wrong either side. They both have a key point in their criticism. And note, his main thesis is, it's not too much religion or too little religion. It's bad religion. We've gotten religion altogether off track. And for him, as I quote, this is the slow motion collapse of traditional Christianity and the rise of a variety of destructive pseudo-Christianities in its place. Now, what's interesting, and he's going to talk about pseudo-Christianities throughout the whole book. And you're going to see some names, and you're going to see some folks, you're going to say, what? I like those people. And he's not saying they're bad. He's just saying when you look at them and how culture has latched onto them, what's happened as a result, and what they lead to when you follow them to an extreme. And note, they increasingly offer distortions. And he said, America's religious as ever. We're as religious as ever. But it's also a place where traditional Christian teachings have been warped and wrapped around justifications for solipsism, anti-intellectualism, jingoism, utopianism, selfishness, and greed. Boom. Whoa. And the book will get into those things. And if you look, we won't have time for it, if you look at page 5, has a summary of where that's all led. And I would point that out to you, so look at page 5 and where some of those critiques have led, and you go, whoa, you go, oh. And think about how he summarizes those things and where it has led. And basically, what he's saying is that for all its piety and fervor, today's United States needs to be recognized for what it is, not a Christian country, but a nation of hypocrites. And you go, oh. Now, for some people, when you make that statement, they go, oh, what do you mean? It's fact. It's a fact. So, what does he do? He basically then sets out for this chapter in the prologue to define what he calls the broad center of the Christian tradition. That's Catholic, that's evangelical, that's traditional Christianity. And he calls it, and I think it's absolutely correct, and I'm glad John talked about mystery this morning. It was very helpful to set the tone here. Says that Christianity is a religion of mystery and paradox. And if you look at bottom of page 9 and page 10, he defines that. What is the mystery and what is the paradox? And I quote that here at the top of the second page. Here's the mystery, here's the paradox. And you probably need to keep that before you as you read through the book. And the problem is for we intellectuals, children of the Enlightenment, what do we want to do with mystery? We want to solve it. What do you want to do with paradoxes?
Get rid of it.
You want to resolve it,
We can't do it.
right? Solve the mystery, resolve the paradox. And when we do, what's the danger?
We've made things up.
you're going to distort what it's all about. And John was very helpful in quoting Einstein this morning about the universe. And he says, look at the universe and the mystery behind it all, and our pea brain can never, ever resolve it. Never, ever. We are incapable of comprehending the vastness of the universe. And if it's good enough for Einstein, it's good enough for me. I mean, it's one of those kind of things, and yet, have we stopped trying to solve it? No. We'd be better off spending our time on other things that we might be able to make progress on. So, but that's the key, and that's his broad center that he keeps out there. And I want to understand, he defines on page 9 with Alistair McGrath what heresy is. And the page before that, page 8, he talks about heresy. And it should surprise you, does he consider heresy bad?
No.
No, he does not. And you say, what? Why wouldn't he consider it bad? For those of you who read that, why does he not consider it bad, Hank Ginger?
There's a good and a bad to everything. And heresy is one of them. There's no way to say definitively, this is heretical. Something like.
Yeah, well, nobody says when he quotes McGrath, he says the goal is always progress. Always progress. The belief system that's simpler, more reasonable, more authentic, and more up to date. That's what heretics try to do. The goal is always positive. It's not to undermine, it's to improve. Always. And it says, and yet the results often vindicate the older Christian synthesis. Heresy sets out to be simpler and more appealing and more rational, but it often ends up being more extreme.
I like what he said about heresy being, I like the analogy of the flying buttresses of heresy and the orthodoxy of the cathedral, where they actually contribute to the strength of orthodoxy.
Yes, yes.
That made sense to me.
And I think it's good to get that point and understand that. And so it's one of those kind of things, as he sees that, he sets these parameters up in this prologue. And he's saying that understand in trying to make things simpler, easier, more rational, we try to make religion easier. Now, think about our drive-through society. We want everything to be instant, easier for us.
He says something that I think was pretty important. He talked about solipsism and so forth, but one of the things I think he said this, or he should have anyway, is what we do nowadays is we look for the Jesus that we want. That's the key. And then we worship him. So all this searching around, you wonder how these new religions are growing exponentially, and the Orthodox ones are kind of decaying.
And we're going to come across a chapter that talks about making Jesus the ones we want. But that's often the case, because that way it makes it easier. The Jesus that we want, the Jesus that we can understand, the Jesus that operates the way we think it should happen. And you go, that would make things real simple, but no, doesn't happen that way. So note, as you look at, again, at the very end of the chapter, I quote the paragraph down there at the very bottom of the page. As you look at that, you go, huh. I think that, and again, that's where his rhetoric is at its finest. It's at the very end of the chapter. As you look at that paragraph and you read it, what's your reaction to that? As we close out chapter 1, the prologue.
I don't agree with it.
Okay. Well, you see what he's getting at when he's saying that? He said, basically, religion's important no matter where you're for it or against it. It's critical to our culture and our country. And he said, it's important to get that. So what he's tried to do is to say, yes, we are a nation of heretics, but religion in this process is very important for us to get a handle on. And he said, we're going to follow that development through post-World War II. So you catch how he's framing this and the definitions that he's made? Any questions about that prologue?
Yeah, to me, when I read that, I can hear in his words his Roman Catholicism. He converted from being a Pentecostal to being a Roman Catholic. And in a sense, this is very anti-Protestant, because what did the reformers do? They wanted to simplify the Catholic system. The Catholic system was built on all of these church councils and on popes' encyclicals, and that's what Luther and Calvin and all these guys wanted to do. Let's simplify it so the man or woman in the pew with their Bible, they may not be able to quote all of the doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church and all of the saints and everything, but they will know that Jesus Christ is their Savior. So in a sense, for me, when I read up on his background and his faith journey, to go from being a Pentecostal speaking in tongues to being a Roman Catholic who graduates magna cum laude from Harvard, I see that Catholic acceptance of complex faith. And when he quotes various popes through the book and saying, well, this is what this pope said. This is what this pope said. I just sort of, as a Protestant, I say, well, yeah, I understand that, but I want to, at least for me, value my Calvinist heritage and say it's not that bad if, as a Christian, I try to get to the core and say, what is the core of the New Testament? What is the core of the Old Testament? What do I believe that I can say simply to another person without confusing them or going over their head? So that's just a comment in terms of, at least I see the influence of him being a converted Catholic and how he sees, he's comfortable with the Christian faith being complicated. And he calls that orthodoxy. Just my reaction.
Okay, anybody else? Chapter 1. We move on. Now, it says the lost world, and he's dealing with immediately post-World War II. And he spends time looking at what happens to Christianity in America from like 1946, 47 to 1960. And he quotes a lot of statistics about growth within churches in that period, which was enormous. And then he identifies, essentially, picks out talks about a convergence within the Christian community. Basically, as you look at the middle of that page, a kind of Christian convergence was defining feature of the era. And he tries to put a face on it, where he talks about a Protestant intellectual, evangelical preacher, Catholic bishop, and an African-American prophet. And so the intellectual is Reinhold Niebuhr. The evangelical preacher is Billy Graham. The Catholic bishop is basically Fulton Sheen, and the African American prophets and Martin Luther King Jr. And it's sort of interesting as you look at that, those four figures really do stand out for the 1950s in terms of the broad Christian tradition. And I think it's important when you look at Niebuhr, and at the bottom of the page, he generally embraces neo-Orthodox principles. What the heck's that? And he defines that, and it's important to get that definition. And one thing that Niebuhr does is that he puts a strong emphasis on humanity's irredeemable sinfulness. A lot of the folks, the liberal theologians, lose the emphasis on sin. Niebuhr never does, ever. And the emphasis of the tendency to slip toward pride and self-righteousness. And I thought, you know, if you look at the divisive nature of society today, because both liberal and conservatives would call on Niebuhr as a theologian for themselves, I went, time out. If Niebuhr were alive, he'd throw up on both of them, because they both are really to the fault of seeing themselves as being perfect. And he would say, and I think that's one of the strengths of Reinhold Niebuhr. As you look at sort of going back to the traditional confessional nature of the Reformation and holding up not just the ethical message of Jesus, but the saving stress on the saving life and death of Jesus that got lost from 1900 to 1930, 35. It gets recaptured, and understand that Niebuhr was part of that liberal school and sort of himself was converted back to the understanding that he embraces as described here, and really has intellectual gravitas as he stands up and provides insight to understanding culture and society. So he gives sort of great weight toward that in the 50s, and is really the person that provides real emphasis for people to take Christianity seriously intellectually. Billy Graham is a conundrum. Nobody can understand Billy Graham. Because you look at his New York City, and Dalton talks about his New York City crusade in 1957.
That was astounding numbers.
It was
Astounding numbers.
oh, thousands. And the way he went about bringing revivalism to America, and the way in which he did it. And it's interesting, it's rather than exclusivist, it becomes more inclusive as he goes about all this stuff, and it becomes so large that he's got to include local parishes and local churches in that process. And so he really brings that, what was at one time marginalized revivalist movement into the main, not to say main, well, yeah, the mainstream, and makes it very popular. And in the South, ironically, he insists that his crusades be integrated. And that sort of blew people away. I mean, it was like, what? Bill Clinton tells the story about how that influenced him as a young boy in Arkansas, when he said, this will be an integrated crusade or the crusade ain't happening. So he becomes that part of the convergence of making religion significant. And then Fulton Sheen. Did anybody remember seeing him on TV?
Absolutely.
It's like, he brings Catholicism to the masses. And he's an incredible lecturer. He's there, okay, and he really doesn't necessarily talk about Catholicism as he does about Christianity affecting your life. He's sort of like Phil Donahue, this is what Christianity is to your life.
Yeah.
And it was really sort of fascinating to see this guy, and he is a very impressive presence when he comes on TV. And he's very theatrical. And he's very effective in what he does. And he's a tremendous representative of the Catholic Church. And he brings philosophically a Thomistic approach to understanding how, believe it or not, the church is perhaps a better guardian of democracy than the government. And he may not have been wrong from the Thomistic point of view as he looks at that, so that you can trust it. And so you sit there and go, what? What is this all about? And so you see that as being, what? And so that's happening along with Niebuhr, along with Billy Graham. And then you have the African American church, which had been marginalized to the nth degree. You have Brown versus the Board of Education in '54, that gets passed. And then where the political movement and awareness in the African American community took place was in the church. Unlike anywhere else, the church is where that happened in a significant way. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged, this young preacher, emerged as the leader of that through the mid-50s and the end of the 50s. And really asserts the African American church as a key leader within the culture. And I thought sort of interesting this weekend, we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. And there's this book called The Gospel of Freedom, which really focuses on his letter from the Birmingham jail. If you ever want to really get into, this is an intellectual masterpiece that he wrote from the Birmingham jail. I mean, it is absolutely incredible. And if you read his letter from the Birmingham jail, his I Have a Dream speech, and the last speech he gave in Memphis before he's assassinated, those three things give you, I think, the highlight and emphasis of who he was and what he was all about. Just absolutely incredible.
Who wrote the Gospel of Freedom?
Pardon?
For those of us who might want to order that, who wrote it? Just tell me the author.
You can pass it around.
Oh, okay.
Really are significant as you look at that. So it's these four characters he highlights in this chapter and spends some time on all four of them and why they represent. Now, he could have picked other folks too, but these are, for him, key kinds of ways for the lens to look at the convergence and really sort of to underline how religion in America surged in the 50s. Now, the rest of the book's going to talk about how that then, I won't say disintegrates, but then diverges after that.
Chuck, I'll share with the group a story, a Billy Graham story. In the fall of 1951, Billy Graham planned a crusade for Greensboro, North Carolina. Greensboro was a town of only 70,000 people, so it was very sketchy as to whether it would work or not. It would be enough people would come out. There was no building in Greensboro that would accommodate anything like this, so they decided to build a building. The only facility was the football stadium, but it was open, so in the fall, it could be bad weather, and also decided to build a building. A group of church leaders got together, went down to the bank to borrow $75,000 to build a building to have this crusade. The leader of the group told his wife, said, you go to Belk's and buy a dress and put it on your charge account, because they're gonna wanna know if we have credit. So we wanna, the bank's gonna ask if we have credit. They borrowed $75,000, built a building that would house 10,000 people. They built it so the sides could be removed. It was glad that they did, because some of the crowds were 15,000 people in a town of 70,000. So when they got all done, the crusade lasted for 5 weeks, started in the middle of October 1951. When they got through, they sold off the material and got this amount of money back that it cost to build it in the first place. And there's a house in Greensboro, a home in Greensboro today, that is built out of the material that they sold when they tore down the building. At that point in time, it was not integrated. There was a place for blacks and a place for whites to sit. But it was not Billy Graham's idea. It was the city that was trying to enforce that. And he worked very hard, as Chuck said, to get that corrected in future things. Now, one little sidelight to that story, there was a young guy who was entering his junior year at Chapel Hill in October the 20th, 1951. Paul Clark hitchhiked 70 miles from Chapel Hill to Greensboro to go on a Saturday night to go and hear Billy Graham crusade. And it was just great. And I can remember today, just as vivid in my mind, of George Beverly Shea leading them in the altar call, just as I am, without one plea, just for me. And I mean, just really a warm feeling it gives me to remember those times.
Did you go forward?
I did not, and I
went 3 times
had
forward,
some,
just to make sure.
I did not go forward, and I had some trepidation about that on my way back to Chapel Hill, because one of the things that Billy Graham said in the altar call, and he always says this, is don't wait. Do it tonight. This could be your last night on earth. You don't want to wait. And he said, you could be killed in a car wreck. Well, I've got to hitchhike back to Chapel Hill. So I am nervous sitting in the back seat of someone's car all the way to Chapel Hill.
Thinking about Billy Graham.
So,
And you didn't go forward.
But there were 8,000 people during the course of that 5-week crusade who did go forward. So it was a tremendous success. Those that I remember well. Thank you for letting me tell that.
Wow. So as you're going through this chapter and you see those 4 people that represent the convergence that is illustrative of the 50s in America. It's sort of a positive representation of what's going on in the culture. So don't get lost in the weeds. That's what he's doing there. And what I want to close with, again, at the very end of the chapter, again, where he gets really, where he tries to pull stuff together. And it's the next to the last page, the bottom paragraph. Let me read it to you, where he sort of, okay, so what? And this is his so what for this chapter. And he does it pretty much with each of the chapters. And that's why I sort of say, if you can't read the whole chapter, get to the end, because that'll help you. And he says, the critical element in each of these cases that he's just talked about was a deep and abiding confidence. And that confidence is in italics. Not just faith alone, but the kind of faith in Christian faith, and a sense that after decades of marginalization and division, Orthodox Christians might actually be on the winning side of history, both institutionally and intellectually. American Christianity at mid-century offered believers a relatively secure position from which to engage with society as a whole, a foundation that had been rebuilt, as we have seen, rather than simply inherited, and that seemed to be stronger for it. At its best, this culture enjoyed a mix of openness and well-defendedness that any religious tradition should seek in its dealings with the world, supplying believers with both a place to stand and look outward onto the world, as Jody Button put in her 2008 essay on the era, and a system of truth by which other things could be judged.
What page is that?
That's page 53. It's at down at the very bottom of the page. So as you look at that, what's your response to his conclusion?
Absolutely true. And it goes along with the art and architecture and everything else at that time. Everything was looking out. We had, the architects were opening up the windows and doors. Our concept was looking out, being open. Our furniture, everything, our designs, our sculptures were open and more, gave more space for us to be looking out and presenting ourselves. So I think that's fascinating.
Okay. Anybody else?
So, one thing that I thought that Niebuhr stressed that I think is worth all of us thinking about, and especially as we think about potentially the decline of democracy, the decline of our country as it has traditionally been dear to us, and the decline of more personal things. Niebuhr held that success carries within itself the seeds of its ultimate demise. If you stop to think about that, a restaurant, take the most successful restaurant in Tampa, Florida today, will not be in business 15 years from now because it is already developing within its operation the things that are going to ultimately cause it to fail. And so, and think about that in terms of a country, democracy, everything's working fine, we run the world, we do this, we call the shots, but the decay from within because of that very success is going to be the cause of its ultimate failure. It's something to think about. We may not potentially agree with every aspect of it, but I think you take the Roman Empire. You know, who would have thought that anything could ever destroy the Roman Empire? Yet, it carried within itself its own ultimate failure by virtue of its power and success. You don't act like when you're successful, you don't do the things that you need to do and the precautions and all that you need to take to be successful.
Thank you. That's good insight and Niebuhr's insight.
Yeah, my sense is, I wish I would have heard him say more about the ambiente, as they say, of the 1950s. Who's president? Eisenhower. It's a calm guy. He's a war hero. He appeals to all areas of America. So I think part of what he's talking about in that age and the thoughts of that age and the optimism comes from the ambiente of the 1950s. To be in this country, I think as a white person, I would qualify it as a white person in this country in the 1950s, connected to someone who is, you know, the head of the country that's the most powerful country in the world. And so there's this sense of the developing sense of a successful Christian America, and seen in the person of Dwight Eisenhower. My father served under Eisenhower in Europe in World War II. And you have literally tens of millions of young men who Eisenhower was their commanding officer. And 1946, they come back. They have children, me and others in this room, and you have the baby boom. So you fill up Sunday schools, you fill up churches, and Ike is there smiling in those black and white news conferences. Everything's okay. We're solid, we're fine. We're gonna rule the world, and we're gonna build a better place. So I guess part of it, I think, is that sense of a special city on a hill that people like Eisenhower, the winning generation, Tom Brokaw says the greatest generation, that ran all the institutions in the 1950s. And then, as he says, that starts to come apart in the late 60s. Kennedy is assassinated, his brother is assassinated, the Vietnam War, Martin Luther King is assassinated, but in the 50s, that hasn't happened yet. So my sense, I wish I would have heard him look at that and say, well, what effect did the atmosphere have? Because certainly America in the 1950s was unique, very, in a positive way, but very unique. And certain things sort of came together to our advantage as a country.
Well, David Haversham wrote the book, The 50s, which was a classic, where he addresses some of that stuff.
Yeah.
So this is sort of interesting. So he sets that up, and we're going to get the first accommodation in talking about what happens in the 60s next week. I want to thank you all for being here and starting the journey. And if you haven't gotten the book, I would recommend it. And hopefully, we can continue this, and we got through the first 2 chapters in the hour.
Way to go, Chuck.
So,
Way to go.
we'll see what happens as we continue next. You want to close it, John?
Yeah, I'll close this in a prayer, and I'll just point out that if you do not have a copy of the book, there are still 3 remaining in the office. There are 2 remaining in the office. Those are $10 each. You're welcome just to swing by there. You can leave money with a note on Susan's desk would be fine, but there's still 2 copies in the office. I would also point out the email goes out on Thursday as well as Sunday morning. It will have the handout attached to it. If you are not receiving that email right now, please see me after class and I'll make sure you're on that email list. And let's go ahead and close our time with the word of prayer. Holy God, we're grateful for this chance to gather in this space, to learn more and to explore and discuss together. Lord, we're grateful that you are God of all time and all places, and that your steadfast love is evident in our scriptures and in our very lives. Be with us this day. Help us to glorify you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you again for being here.
They're great. I know you went up there, so I put little stickies for the purchase that was left on the keyboard.
Perfect. That's great.